Hello everyone. With respect to the 2008 presidential election, there's a few topics I'd like to cover. First off, I'd like to go over Iraq. There's a lot of discussion about that. Why are we there? How did we get there? And the reasons that we're there, I'm not seeing these being reported. There is an astounding amount of misinformation out on this subject, so I'm going to address some of it here. We don't have time to address all of it, but the primary reason we are in Iraq is because of the fact that Iraq was a threat to the region. It's an unstable region, and it causes all sorts of problems. We learned our lesson in World War II. You do not let a megalomaniac with the wealth of a nation at his disposal run rampant. Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait. He engaged in a 10-year war with Iran. After he invaded Kuwait, he was massing troops and equipment, tanks, on the Saudi Arabian border. He was trying to take over the region. We've learned our lesson in the past. You do not let that continue. You don't let that get out of control. He had to be stopped. He was a major problem. It goes all the way back to in 1991 when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. It was a sovereign nation. He had no business being there. He tried to annex Kuwait and make it part of Iraq, which at one time, my understanding is, it did used to belong to Iraq. However, it was removed by force. That resulted in a ceasefire agreement. And there were several characteristics associated with that ceasefire agreement. There were sanctions, there were resolutions. Ever since 1991, he has been in violation of several of the sanctions and resolutions that were put in place. You've heard the phrase, the 17 UN resolutions with respect to Iraq, and you've also heard about the oil for food scandal. Well, that is basically Saddam defying every one of the resolutions that the United Nations put forward to try to keep him from causing more trouble. He killed his own people by gassing the Kurds. He had a 10-year war with Iran, and obviously the Kuwait issue. The problem with the United Nations Security Council is there are 5 permanent members: the United States, Great Britain, France, Russia, and China. Each of those 5 permanent members have veto authority on any resolution. Saddam Hussein was crazy, but he wasn't stupid. With the oil for food scandal, what he was doing was he was effectively buying veto votes in the United Nations Security Council. He would get contracts with France, Russia, and China. He could not buy the United States and Britain. He knew that. But he could buy France, Russia, and China. He could have them implement votes in the United Nations Security Council that would have prevented sanctions from being created. It would have prevented them from being implemented or implemented properly. Also, when he has the authority to choose which companies he sets his contracts with, and some of the terms were legal and others were not. But the big problem was he set up contracts with France, Russia, and China. The contracts were set up such that they would not be effective until the sanctions were ended. These are contracts that he was engaging with countries that had veto authority on sanctions. How do you think they're going to vote if they have money waiting on sanctions? The diplomatic process was stymied by corruption in the oil for food scandal and Saddam Hussein effectively buying veto votes. Also, Saddam was paying $25,000 to the surviving family members of Palestinian suicide bombers. He was financing terrorism openly and advertising it. He was a threat in a lot of different ways. He was supposed to be allowing UN weapons inspectors unfettered access to all the facilities that they had set as areas of interest. He had agreed to it, he reneged on his negotiations, and he began kicking the UN weapons inspectors out of places that they were supposed to be allowed to inspect. Something a lot of people aren't aware of is the fact that on 2 separate occasions, Saddam Hussein had functioning centrifuge factories. Now these centrifuges only serve one purpose, and that is to enrich uranium to a weapons grade capacity. These centrifuges took a lot of time to develop. They were developed primarily through a lot of illegal means and illegal dealings with members of other countries. These centrifuges have to rotate at roughly 60,000 RPMs in order to get uranium enriched to a level that will work with a nuclear device. On 2 separate occasions, he had achieved manufacturing facilities using these 60,000 RPM centrifuges that are capable of creating weapons-grade uranium enrichment. On one occasion, the Israelis, acting unilaterally, struck the facility and destroyed it. They didn't wait for the UN to get involved. They didn't seek advice. They protected their own interests, as they should have, as they had a right to do, and they bombed the facility themselves with their own airstrike. The second occasion, where he had a manufacturing facility up and running and was ramping up the production capacity of the facility, was roughly the same time that he invaded Kuwait. And when he invaded Kuwait, that brought national attention on what was going on within his borders. When people found out what he was doing, those facilities were dismantled. But even after the United States invaded Baghdad, he was still holding on tight to his dream of eventually achieving a nuclear bomb, which is why he instructed Mahdi Obedi, his chief nuclear scientist, to bury the technical details, the plans on how to create those centrifuges in his garden. Wrote an outstanding book on the subject, The Bomb in My Garden. Mahdi Obedi, he lives in America now. Has all the details. Excellent book. The uranium enrichment was a very, very critical factor in one of the reasons we are in Iraq. According to Mahdi Obedi, Iraq's and Saddam Hussein's chief nuclear scientist, building a nuclear bomb is tricky. That's his word, not mine. But it can be done. With a country that has the amount of resources, engineering, and workforce that Iraq has, it can be done. What is difficult to do is create or manage a fuel capable of working with a nuclear bomb. That's what requires that 60,000 RPM centrifuge to enrich uranium to that level. Nuclear power plants don't need uranium to be that highly enriched. A nuclear bomb does. That is the most difficult part of putting together a nuclear detonating device. After the year 2000, one of the problems with Saddam, with his refusing to let United Nations weapons inspectors in, one of the grievances that even Hans Blix, who did not agree with going to Iraq, one of the grievances that he cited was that there were 1,000 tons of chemical munitions that, according to his own report, were unaccounted for. 1,000 tons, not 1,000 pounds. That's 1,000 tons. That is 1,000 tons, 1,000 truckloads of chemical munitions that Iraq was supposed to have destroyed. They knew they had it. They admitted it. They had listed it in their list of things they were going to get rid of because they were no longer allowed to have that. But they could not account for what had happened to it. They couldn't account for the destruction of it. They could not account for the whereabouts of it. It was just missing. 1,000 tons of chemical munitions. Nobody knew where it was. With respect to the war, if it was so wrong, if it was so vile a thing to do, why did Joe Biden, John Kerry, John Edwards, and Hillary Clinton also vote to authorize the war? Not just to authorize the ability to go to war, but to actually authorize to go to war. That is what that vote was. Don't be misled on that. John Edwards told Chris Matthews on Hardball he was not misled on Iraq. And going back to Joe Biden is running for Vice President of the United States, yet when the Russia and Georgia conflict emerged, his suggestion was to take it to the United Nations. Apparently a man who is now running for Vice President, who has spent 30-some years in the Senate, forgot that Russia has veto authority, being one of those 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, and they can veto any resolution set against Russia. To remind you, this man is running for Vice President of the United States, and he's been in the Senate for 30-some years, and he doesn't know this. Now, going into Kuwait to get Saddam out, that was the right thing to do. A lot of people agree with that. Joe Biden, who was going for Vice President, he actually voted against the Kuwaiti resolution. If Obama had his way, Saddam Hussein would still be in charge in Iraq. And if Joe Biden had his way, Saddam would be in Iraq, Kuwait, possibly Iran, and most likely Saudi Arabia. This is not a group of people that we need in the White House.